Hey, what's going on? It's another episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob. What I do here is I watch new movies, and it's been a minute. I tell you, it's been 3 years. We're going on 3 years of this podcast. I started this at the beginning of 2022 when I was at home, sick with COVID, had nothing else to do, couldn't be around anybody else. So I sat and I watched a new movie every day. That was cool for a minute. I think it was about 3 or 4 months. And then some things happened. Life kind of got in the way. I say got in the way. Uh, Lost my mom. That really changed some things, changed some perspectives on what films mean, what stories mean, and how I look at films and how I appreciate the work that so many filmmakers and artists and performers put into films, you know? So I started it back up and I thought, all right, I need to kind of recommit. If I'm going to do this, I got to do it for real and do it right and do it in a way that's still fun. So a part of that was I wanted it to be a fun kind of experience just to listen to. And that meant, oh, let me put more work into it. Let me put trailers in it. Let me put audio clips. Let me just have more production involved. But man, that's a lot of work. And as it turns out, now that the podcast is also available on YouTube, well, hey, one of the nice things about putting the feed up on YouTube is you can monetize every episode, right? The videos, if they get any watches, which honestly, I don't think anybody's really watching it yet on YouTube. I could be wrong, but the problem is all those clips and trailers and music and all that stuff that I put in the early episodes, doesn't work. So I still want those to be available to people, but because I still want them to count to the number, this film streak has been going. We're almost to 600 films now. But I know that people will never get to see those on YouTube. And honestly, it's kind of like, it's a different way of doing this podcast than I do it now. So what I've done is I've taken to putting the older episodes on Patreon. You can find those at patreon.com/filmstreak. Those will be available there if you happen to want to check them out and see some of the earlier films and what I had to say about them or some of the guests that I might have had in that time. See what they brought to the table. There's still the list that I have on IMDb where you can still find all the films that I've talked about. But the episodes themselves, they're going to be kind of going away, or at least only available to people who pony up a little bit. It's not a lot, a little bit, just to check out those early episodes. Anyway, all that aside, you can still go to filmstreak.com. You can find the current episodes or more recent episodes, and you can subscribe in your podcast player of choice. You can even sign up to get these by email if that's easier for you. I appreciate it either way, whichever way you want to listen. Thank you. Let's get to this episode. This episode is a special one to me because, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, the original source, the book, it's something that I read when I was, I think, in like junior high. And I didn't really have a connection to any of the earlier films. I could say that I think the one film that kind of stuck in my memory, and I can't even tell you why, honestly, because I don't even really remember it very much, but it was the film Love at First Bite. You ever see that? It's with George Hamilton, and it is, I guess, kind of a parody, or uh, it's just kind of a comedic take on the Dracula legend, right? Or the films of Dracula. It's not the Dracula Dead and Loving It with Leslie Nielsen. It's not that one. That's a straight up spoof, right? But the film Love at First Bite, for whatever reason, it was interesting to me because I had never heard of a character like that. I didn't see the original Universal Dracula from the 30s, but that's one that I wanted to talk about in this episode because I had to kind of retrace the steps. So, in order to do that, I said, all right, let me go back. Let me go back all the way back to the beginning. The very first adaptation of the Dracula story that I understand is from 1922. That's Murnau's Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. And that one is a little more of a reimagining of the story. It's not a straight adaptation from the novel because it changes the location, changes some of the characters, even changes the main character from Dracula to Count Orlok, right? And it's a silent film, but it's very heavily it relies on the use of music, and it relies on some very striking cinematography for the time, for sure. But even today, I think it still has a very distinct feel and look to it. That is a film that, watching it now, today, we're talking over 100 years later, I can appreciate the importance of it, the significance of it as a work of cinema. I think it leaves some things to be desired, of course. I mean, it's sort of crude, but it does have a real sort of quality to it, an eeriness, a hauntingness to it. Is that a word, hauntingness? I'm just saying it does kind of stick with you. And I'm not quite sure why, other than the feeling it gives me. And so going from that to Dracula from 1931. This is the one with Bela Lugosi, who I wasn't familiar with other than this was a character. This was the thing that Count Chocula was based off of. This is the one that the Count from Sesame Street was based off of. There's so many different variations that this character, this one specific depiction of Dracula, pretty much influenced for decades. Right? Including most of the films that I'm going to talk about in this episode. And I think that says a lot about the quality of the film and the sort of craftsmanship of it, that not only does it resonate as a story, as an adaptation of the novel, but as a cinematic work. Like it does land. It's effective. I think it feels very kind of slow and a little stiff compared to a film today. But of course, this is very much a film of its time. I can say that it's a little more faithful to the novel, I think. But I just feel like it's a little bit of a slow burn. And it doesn't ever really rise to the occasion of being scary or terrifying, or it doesn't invoke any of the sort of feelings that Nosferatu from 1922 did. It's interesting and it's a well done adaptation, but it just lacks a certain energy, a certain spark, I think. So when you go from that in the 30s, we'll jump forward to 1970, because I know there were some films in between there that were produced, and there were different adaptations of the character and of the story, or even taking the character into different places and different, I don't know, different genres even. I wasn't really interested in that. I was trying to stick more to like the different retellings or adaptations of the original novel. And so the next one I wanted to see was Count Dracula from 1970. And that's Christopher Lee. It's directed by Jess Franco, who my familiarity with is kind of light, but I know that he makes a little more mature or adult types of films that really don't adhere to any rules of cinema or taste or tact, And something about that actually kind of intrigued me. It's like, how would a filmmaker like that take on the Dracula legend, the story? Like, would you lean into the sort of romanticized, the passionate, the sexualized version of this character? And this film really doesn't do that. It's actually pretty bland. And not only that, but the performances aren't great. The writing isn't great. The direction isn't great. It's probably not one of the better adaptations of this story. I mean, filmmaking wise, I saw I think it's on Arrow, they have a release of this, and it looks pretty pretty well preserved for the time, but the impact of it, the sort of I don't know, the drive that it has, it feels like it was just made to be made. It doesn't feel like this was someone who really had a passion for this story. And so the next film I do want to jump forward to is well, actually, here's a couple of interesting choices, right? There's a Blacula, which I really wasn't sure I wanted to see, only because I didn't know if it was truly what you would consider a an adaptation of the original story, right? Like this character is not Count Dracula, but he basically is another version of the same character. The thing that did intrigue me though is that it's a very modern, very relatable version of this story. And I think part of that has to do with look, you taking this character, this legend, this myth of Dracula, this vampire, and you just clashing that with 70s black culture. And how does that work? Right? Because that's something that as I watched all of these films, it occurred to me. It's like, wait, how come nobody has tried to adapt Dracula into like modern day? With, you know, some of the sort of trappings of society as it is now versus, you know, the 19th century or even the early 20th century. Like, what would Dracula be like in the world where there are cell phones, right? Or the internet or social media? And this is not quite that, of course. This is 1972, but it is also a look at it from just a different cultural perspective. And in that way, it's like, it's got some entertaining moments. And I feel like it's at least a little bit of a milestone for black cinema of the 70s. Still, overall, it's not a great film. It's kind of corny, kind of cheesy. The special effects aren't great. The direction isn't entirely great. It's got an interesting performance by the star, William Marshall, who is this, I don't know, just very suave, kind of debonair character who basically is Dracula, but he's just got a different origin story, right? So the other film I wanted to get to here is an interesting one because it's Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski that are kind of double teaming this Dracula story, but they're doing it under the sort of guise of remaking the 1922 film Nosferatu. That's what it's called, Nosferatu the Vampyre. But the characters in this aren't from that film. They're from the Dracula story. You got Count Dracula, you got Lucy Harker, Jonathan Harker, Renfield. And it's an interesting sort of mashup of the two adaptations, right? Now, the intriguing part to all of this is Klaus Kinski is known to be, or was known to be, a very kind of explosive and chaotic presence on sets, and not always productive and useful for a film. And Werner Herzog, of course, is a very distinct voice and has a very distinct style and types of subject matter he likes to make films about. So how would these two really work out this legend, which we've already kind of been familiar with now for a long time? And I think there are some really interesting cinematic choices and narrative choices here. But I think for me, the revelation, I guess, is Isabelle Adjani and Bruno Ganz. I mean, I think the fact that, Isabelle Adjani as Lucy Harker is just magnetic to watch. I think that kind of does some of the work for Klaus Kinski and his Dracula being so drawn to her. Like she's kind of irresistible in some way. Is it a great adaptation? I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. After one watch, I kind of don't feel like it. But I think it's worth maybe watching again and maybe just sitting with it a little bit. So following that up, there's a film that came out not long after this, which, I kind of wonder, was this like just another bite at the apple, where it's called Vampire in Venice, or I think it has another name even. I think it's called Nosferatu a Venezia, right? Which is an Italian film, and it was kind of a troubled production from what I've seen and what I've read here. But it was just another way to get Klaus Kinski back as this character. Now the thing is, this is just a very kind of sideways adaptation now. I can't really call it a sequel, but at the same time, it doesn't even follow the same rules of the original film of this Nosferatu or just the Dracula legend. Like you've got some really strange things happening with the character to the point where it doesn't feel like anybody cared if this actually became a Dracula story or not. Like it was just like, we just want to make this film because, well, why not? Right. I don't think that's a great reason to make a film. And I think this film proves it. So, we get to the 90s and you've got the Francis Ford Coppola version. And that is one that, for me, I think it hit me just at the right time, not long after I had read the novel. And I think the sort of way it was made, the way the film was made, it was so striking and so visionary in a way. Not because it's just got great cinematography and costume design and music and performances, but because it also kind of was a throwback. The techniques, the special effects, the visual effects were done in very old school ways. And we're talking here in the 90s where there could have been some use of CGI and some more interesting or elaborate sort of either stunt work or special effects or whatever, but they really did these things in ways that had kind of been long forgotten. And I didn't really appreciate that until much later. I mean, I just remember thinking, oh, this is a new, far more accurate retelling of the novel than any of the other films that I had seen, including all the ones I just mentioned. And I think the fact that it was so, it seemed to not have any rules. Like there were no bounds to what this film was going to show us. It made Dracula a passionate character. It made Dracula a sexual character, a violent character, right? A horrifying presence. And yet, of course, it did add some things to the story that I don't remember it being about this sort of age-old, long-lost love type of thing. I mean, there might have been some elements to that, but in the novel, I think it is a little more like Dracula is just a kind of a force. But here in the was it 92, 91, 92 when that version came out? That's the one that has really kind of imprinted on me. And I think a lot of that also has to do with Gary Oldman, like his performance in that. It's like above and beyond. Like I'd never seen someone go that far into a horror movie character. So for me, I feel like that's the one that has really kind of been stapled in time. Like that one's not going anywhere for me. Consider that a favorite. So I moved on to Dracula 2000, and it's not a great film, I have to say. I think it's interesting in that it is trying to modernize the Dracula legend. Like I said earlier, it's like this seems like something that would intrigue me, but the way it's kind of done, and of course, it's really the execution. Like there's so much like just shoddy filmmaking in this, including some pretty rough looking CGI and some not great performances. And it even kind of stunned me as like, wait, this is Gerard Butler? Really? I didn't see that. You didn't imagine that's where we were. Because it's only like 5 years later, he makes 300 and like that's the same guy. So anyway, watch that. Wasn't very impressed, but I think the next couple of films were the ones that really kind of, you could start to see there's a turn. Like this story, this legend is just not, it's running out of gas. There's Van Helsing from 2004, which has Hugh Jackman in the character of Van Helsing. And yet I can't really even say this is about Dracula at all. I mean, it's got a character from the Dracula story, but it's not so much about that. It's about his Van Helsing's adventures. And it ultimately kind of leads us there, but it's just a very kind of odd, like backwards take on the story. And I guess it's more of an adventure film than a horror film or even some sort of tragedy. I don't know. I didn't really get the point of this one. The next one was 2012 Dracula 3D, or Argento's Dracula. It was from Dario Argento, who, I've talked about in a few episodes here, of one of the sort of masters of the giallo genre. And yet this film, it feels like somebody else's film. Like there's really nothing in this that I saw was a signature kind of Argento move. I saw some pretty rough looking CGI again. And this is way after Dracula 2000. So you would think, this must have come along. Like the technology must have been there. But I think part of it was like, let's make this 3D. And, this is 2012. So you're like, okay, well, this must have been on that wave of films coming out after Avatar in 2009, where they're like, well, let's make it all 3D. Everything's 3D now. And this one feels so forced and so just not well done. And I feel like it's a real mark on Dario Argento's filmography, because this seems like this would have been right up his alley, this story. So the next several films I wanted to talk about, because I feel like, oh, these are way more modern now. We're really up into present day, pretty much. We get to Renfield in 2023, which is a sort of a reverse version of this. Again, sort of like Van Helsing. It's not telling us the Dracula story specifically. It's telling us the story of another character in the novel, in the original sort of legend. And that is the character of Renfield. And here being the sort of subservient, the subordinate to Dracula himself, who, look, in this film, it's Nicolas Cage, and he's doing the Nicolas Cage thing. He's going big and he's going strong. And I got to say, I'm here for it. I really enjoyed it. It's fun. It's a comedy. It's violent. It's brutal. It's bloody. But it sort of works. It's a good time. And the only thing that really just kind of doesn't work for me entirely is Awkwafina and her character. And it's not even so much the character. I think it's just her performance. It feels too Awkwafina-ish, Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I think for me, it just takes me out of the film. You got Ben Schwartz, Nicholas Hoult. They're all doing their thing. And they're playing by the same rules. They're in the same movie. But Awkwafina, I feel like she's in a different movie somehow. And so also from 2023, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which I remember reading some early on, I guess when it was coming out or about to come out, is essentially kind of like Alien, right? It's like you got these people on this ship, and this is from the novel, right? This is the ship that Dracula takes from Transylvania to England. And this is that voyage and what it's like to be basically trapped on a boat in the middle of the ocean with a monster. And yeah, it kind of is Alien. And it works in the sense that you know what this is. You're not going into this blind of like, what are we dealing with? You know what this is. And so then it's just a little bit of a matter of the suspense of how are these people going to get out of this? And of course, if you know the story, they don't. But it's still interesting to see if somehow they might. Now, the one thing about this film that I guess I could see why they wanted to make a change. One character does manage to survive this and goes on to basically hunt Dracula in England when they arrive. I don't really know how that susses out. That doesn't feel too legit to me. But yeah, I don't know if the idea was to leave it open for some kind of sequel or another film or some kind of series or whatever. I would have rather they just did it the right way, tell the story like it's originally been told, but give me the just like isolate this one chapter or one part and do it justice. And here I think, oh, you're trying to lead me into something else. And I wasn't really feeling that part of it. Otherwise, I thought the film was kind of effective. I mean, for being a sort of a closed quarters, claustrophobic story about, people trying to fight a monster they don't know what it is and they don't know how to kill. The other film I saw, which was from 2024 now, is Abigail. And Abigail, if you don't know, because the marketing for it is a little bit cloudy on what exactly this film is, you would think, oh, okay, well, this is some sort of kidnapping, heist type crime thriller or something. And then there is kind of the tip off of like, okay, well, the little girl's a vampire. And these people don't know what they're getting into. They're trying to kidnap this girl, but she's actually a vampire. So kind of gnarly situation, right? Well, the other thing is that she's not just a vampire, she's Dracula's daughter, which I didn't know was a thing until I saw this movie. And I can't say it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think somebody should kind of remember that if you're going into this, just keep it in mind. So, it's not specifically said, I don't think, that this is Dracula's daughter, but there is a character in this film called Father, played by, I think it's Matthew Good. And I think it's pretty clear this is who we're dealing with. I think it's one of those things like it's going to go unspoken, but you should know what's up. And this one, I thought, this kind of got me closer to what I was expecting, what I would always kind of had wished for is like a modern, present day sort of gritty retelling or adaptation of this story, this legend in this world, put it that way. Because you've got all these characters who are they talk like real people, they deal with things like real people, and I think that is a fresh take because that's part of the problem with so many of the adaptations of this story is it's kind of trapped in time. The original novel was, I think it was 1897, and a lot of the trappings and the sort of storytelling conventions that it uses, even down to like dialogue and some of the motivations for the characters, they're kind of stuck in that time. And so I've always wanted to see like a new kind of version of that. And this isn't quite that. This is kind of like a side story in a way, but it's at least updating us, is getting us to present day, which I was kind of into. I was kind of digging it. Plus, I think it's actually pretty effective. The way that this all plays out, it's got some suspense. It's got some violence to it. It's pretty brutal, but I think it still kind of keeps us in the same ballpark. I got to say, for me, I was pretty impressed. It's not the greatest of these films, I don't think, but I was still pretty impressed. So this next one is Nosferatu, and this is from writer and director Robert Eggers. And, I remember seeing The Witch all these years ago now, and I just thought, wow, this is such a different sort of mind that is working here. That was a prime example of like, no, these people are talking like they talked at that time. And even the Northmen, I think there's an element to that where it's foreign, at least for an American audience, but it's also kind of mystical and otherworldly and kind of scary. And in this film, it's kind of the same thing. It's set in a different time and the characters talk in a way that those characters talk. And yet there is a sort of a haunted nature to not just the performances, but the sort of, I don't know, there's like an energy that this entire film is just laced with. And the one thing I'll say is that it deviates enough from the original Dracula story to feel like something new. Because it's not, even though it's called Nosferatu, it's not exactly a remake of that film either. It is something new. It really is. It has the same bones as Dracula, but it is not quite Nosferatu. It is honestly some kind of new monster, really. And when you see the way that Bill Skarsgård is made up and done as the Count in this film, it's pretty striking. And, I'll give it this much. I think everybody else in the film does a great job. Lily Rose Depp, Nicholas Hoult, even Willem Dafoe, who I think is the only character who really kind of goes a little big, kind of becomes a little bit of a cartoon. I think it still kind of works. It doesn't go too far. So all in all, I mean, I think, is this one the strongest film? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly done like to the nines. Like it's from top to bottom. It is so well put together and so well kind of thought out and executed, from the cinematography to the visual effects and the performances. Everything is just top tier. And yet, I came away with it feeling a little bit underwhelmed in a way. And I'm not really sure why. I feel like it didn't have the same sort of fire that the Francis Ford Coppola did, at least to my mind. This one seems dark and seems haunting and it seems vicious, but it doesn't seem passionate. I don't know. That's my take on it. And whether that changes over time, I don't know. I may find that this one really kind of nails it. But I think the fact that it's just not quite authentic to the novel, even if it is so like spectacularly done, everything from like the typography in the opening credits to some of the cinematography where it just feels like it's all natural light, and the locations, which feel very kind of ancient in some places. I think there's a real kind of rawness to it that works. But, everything you might see in terms of like promotional stuff for the film is like, it feels very kind of gray, right? It feels like a lot of like, it's almost black and white, very monochromatic. And I think there's a point to where that starts to intrude on the story itself, where I feel like this film has no life in it. I guess that's where I'm coming around to. Think about it. This is a film about Nosferatu, right? A vampire, the vampire, or Dracula, whatever. Blood is a big part of the thing here. I mean, that's like the mojo that makes everything work. There's not a lot of blood in this film. And if it is, it's not red. And it doesn't got to be like bright red like paint, but it's got to be something that is striking. I think that is the power of it. That is the fear that it causes, right? It's just instinct. Red is danger. Red is horror. And it's just not a lot in this film. And I think it's maybe a subconscious thing, but I think this film loses edge by not really giving us that. So I don't know. It's a great film. I don't know if I really consider it one of my favorite adaptations of it, but I'll give it time and I'll watch it again for sure. So in the meantime, hey, that's been a lot of Dracula, a lot of vampires. And now I got to move on. So anyway, if you want to get some of the earlier episodes, like I said, you can go to filmstreak.com. I'll put a link up to the Patreon, or maybe, you know what, I might even do the episodes there, but they'll be behind a little bit of a wall. I don't know. I'm still working on that part. I do want to make them available to people, but I know that I can't basically put them out for the public. But I did put work into them. So I do want you to hear them. And of course, look, if you're trying to keep up with this, maybe you're not, who cares? I'm trying to keep up with this. So all of those early episodes, I think it's like the first 60 episodes or something, they count towards the streak. So that's a lot. Anyway, go to filmstreak.com. You can find out more there. You can subscribe, do all that. And in the meantime, winter is here for sure, right? That weather is cold outside. So just stay warm, stay tight, and don't let the Draculas bite. Oh, and watch something new.